All right, welcome to the Gateway API meeting for December 13. We've got a lot going on. First off, I wanted to highlight that it looks like we have just enough people to keep a meeting on the books for December 20. I don't know, it'll be a relatively lightly attended meeting, but I think we have at least 5 people that can make it. So I think as long as we have agenda items, I think it's worth meeting then, because our 2 meetings after that will be canceled. We've already agreed to cancel December 27 and January 3. So this coming meeting will be our last meeting of the year. With that, I wanted to highlight this upcoming release, patch release. I think it was John actually that pointed out this bug, and thank you for catching this. But essentially, when we added reference policy, we missed how important omit empty was. Leaving omit empty accidentally in this JSON tag meant that you could omit namespace entirely, and that really had no meaning. It was an invalid configuration. And based on that, I think we're considering this a bug fix and not an API change so much, even though it is technically also an API change. But because there's not really a valid interpretation of an empty namespace here, I think this is an acceptable patch. And I also think it's important to try and get it out before we go to beta. So for those reasons, I'm proposing a 0.4.1 patch release. This matches up with our versioning guidelines roughly, and how we described releasing new versions, but this is a non-traditional kind of bug fix in that it is backwards incompatible. Yeah, so that is a thing. There's been some discussion on the initial issue for this, which is 963, or sorry, 962. I'll get the numbers right eventually, but that's where this is coming from. And yeah, I think James, I didn't respond to your comment. I'm not sure if James is on this call yet. I don't see him, but yeah, it does unfortunately mean that you could leave it blank. So I don't think any of us really realized that when it got in, or at least we certainly didn't catch it. But this adjusts that. So this is suggesting that we go through the full release process just so we can fix this one bug. There was another bug that was annoying that I'd like to include in this patch release, but that other bug didn't seem to justify a patch release on its own. But now that we have 2, it seems worth cutting a release for. So I've just kind of got these all in order here. It seems like so far I've got a few LGTMs on the bug fix. And once we get the bug fix in and the versioning guidelines, we can go ahead and actually cut a release. So yeah, that's all I'm thinking. And I should also clarify that I'm thinking of, I've created a new release 0.4 branch, which mirrors Kubernetes upstream. So this release is really just all, these 2 patches on top of the 0.4.0 release. We're not trying to cut master as 0.4.1. We've added a lot more to our main branch. Instead, just adding these 2 specific fixes on top of 0.4.0 and cutting a new 4.1 release. Any questions, any hesitancy about cutting a new release for this purpose? Cool. All right. I will keep on running then. But that's 0.4.1. If you have any final thoughts, do let me know. But I would personally love to get this out this week. I know we've got holidays coming up. As you can see, we've got a couple meetings that are going to be canceled in not too long. I'd love to get this particular patch release out sooner than later, just so that we don't have it looming over us in the new year. I'd rather cut this and then immediately shift focuses back to 0.5.0 and beta. But yeah, with that, let me hand it over. I think Chow, I saw you on the call. Chow has proposed a new gap for port matching. This corresponds with an issue that I think John had raised last week. And we have roughly vaguely talked about port matching in other contexts before, but this is specifically adding port matching or port concept to routes, which maybe Chow, I'll let you describe the specifics of what you're thinking here.
Yeah, sure. So our team is working on a traffic management service where service mesh is one of our most important use case, and we are using Gateway API as our interface on Kubernetes, and that's the background. And we find that port matching is a useful feature that we want, and is missing in Gateway API today. So hence the proposal. The proposal now is to add a new field port to parent ref for destination port matching. So when the route specify a port in the parent ref, it means the route only applies to the port specified there. And there are a few alternatives that we consider, like adding port match as a dedicated struct into all routes. And we find it doesn't really make sense for ingress use case, so we didn't go with that. And also, there's an option to use section name in the paragraph today for port matching that results in a less explicit API, and it could also complicate the validation on section name. So that we didn't go with that either. So that's what we end up having here, is adding a new field port into parent ref.
Cool. Well, yeah, thank you for bringing this step together. I chatted with Chow a bit before this about how we could potentially structure this, and you know, I'm biased, but I think this is a sensible approach that both makes sense to ingress, you know, for ingress use cases, but also enables, I think, a key use case for mesh routing. I think this is a reasonable approach. I can see, you know, I think this example here of, you know, a user wanting to say, I want to expose my application on port 80, and so they don't need to know name or anything like that. They can just, you know, they can just say, hey, I want to attach to this gateway listening on port 80 or port 443 or whatever it happens to be. That seems like it's a useful concept. I do hate to complicate parent ref, but this feels like a pretty sensible way to add in this functionality. I'm interested in what others think, though. I'm really especially interested in, Harry, but also interested in Shane, since you've specifically mentioned, you had briefly explored port matching here in your address matching gap. So interesting feedback from everyone, but with that, open it up.
Yeah, so I mean, if what happens if the field is not specified, like if you don't specify the port on the parent ref?
I think that's just as valid. You know, I think it's analogous to not specifying a section name on parent ref, and that it's valid. So in the sense of gateway, that means I just want to bind to the entire gateway. If your parent resource happens to be something like representing a mesh, it likely means you want to bind on all ports or something like that. I hate to be too prescriptive about how a mesh would implement this for routing, but that's how I would assume it would be interpreted.
Okay, and what happens if you specify port 8080 and the gateway is not listening on 80 or any other resource?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, again, it would be similar to a section name that is missing, like that. this has very similar semantics to a section name. And so if you specify a section name that does not exist on a gateway per se, I think we already have status conditions. Like I think it's an invalid reference. I forget the specifics, but I think we would have to treat this similarly. So it's basically an invalid parent ref if you refer to something that doesn't exist. But that's a good thing. I'm not sure if that is explicitly covered in the spec yet, but that'd be a good thing to call out.
Okay, and then the third thing that I wanted to ask is the destination port part is a bit, I haven't read this, but when I was just looking at this during this meeting, it's a bit confusing. Is it destination of the gateway, destination port on the gateway, or the upstream hop? Like there are two connections involved. So some clarification there would be helpful.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think for my interpretation of this, yeah, Chow, maybe you can correct me here.
No, go ahead. You're right. So yeah, where's the destination of the traffic?
Right. Yeah. So I think for mesh that becomes pretty straightforward. If that is the port of the request, and I think that's also, I think for gateway we're talking about the port of the listener, which is the port of the request, but not necessarily the port that the request is getting forwarded on, like not necessarily the port of the backend. Is that the distinction you were trying to make, Harry?
Yeah.
But I think this needs to line up with the port of the listener specifically, the gateway listener in that case, and it somewhat clarifies that here, but it's vague enough that yeah, we should add a bit more detail there. That's a good point.
And didn't we, like I think Micah is mentioning the same thing in the chat, so maybe I'll let him speak to this.
Yeah, I'm wondering, I see that the GEP specifically mentions section name as an alternative, and right, so that's discussed, but it still seems strange to me because I thought the whole reason you would specify a section name was to say, I want this listener, this specific port. So does this GEP completely supersede section name for gateways?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think section name is a bit more precise than port. Port is a more generic way of referencing a listener on a gateway. Port just basically says, I don't care what listener as long as it's listening on 80. Whereas section name says, I want this specific listener. That it's a really tiny difference. I think if we go through the goal of this or introduction, I think this is a field that is primarily driven by a mesh routing use case, and it's nice that it also has a reasonable and understandable meaning for ingress, but it certainly does overlap with section name for sure, and that's unfortunate. Here, go ahead, Bowie.
Yeah, it would help if we put in, for example, do we envision adding more than port to satisfy that use case in the future, or is it limited just to port? And I'm assuming this is because, yeah, I think like distinguishing between this and the section name and why this specifically would be useful.
Yeah, that's a good point. To go back to the section name original proposal, which I think came from me. I know at that point in time, the idea was that section name was the simplest possible thing we could think of at the time, but that we were open to expanding it with more capabilities. I think the idea at the time that had specifically come up was some form of selection, which we thought was too complicated, but that there was still room left to kind of expand the upwards attachment specification, I guess, the parent ref specification. And I look at this as kind of an extension of that. But yeah, like you're saying, Bowie, I think we should document clearly when you would want to use one versus the other, if we were to go forward with this.
And I have a question towards Chow is, and does that mean that for the mesh, for your use case, the parent ref is not pointing to a gateway object or pointing to some other SDO object? Or am I missing something totally?
Yeah, so today it's implementation specific. So for our implementation, we have created a custom resource definition just for mesh. And the routes will point to the mesh. And we will use the port in the parent ref as the field for port matching.
I see. So in that case, whatever we talked about earlier, the section name that's a part of gateway object definition is not relevant here because the parent ref is not pointing to gateway object. It's pointing to, the parent ref is pointing to some other object is outside scope of this gateway. That correct? Is my understanding correct?
Yeah, it's correct for our implementation. But Rob and Kirby and Ron, the meaning of section name can be implementation specific. For other implementation, they may choose to use section name in a different way. But for us, yes, we don't use section name.
Yeah, that's completely right. And I would say that section name could be useful for any mesh that, you know, is segmented in any kind of meaningful way, you know, that I think there are some meshes out there that segment by different networks, and so you may want to say, I want to attach to this mesh on a specific network or on a specific, yeah, again, I don't know the specific implementations, but I think there's space for implementation specific use cases of section name on non-gateway resources. But the only thing we've defined for section name in a consistent, like, core way is really that gateway, what it means on a gateway.
Mm-hmm. But in my case, in my interpretation here is that true that in this particular case, the parent ref is not really pointing to a gateway object. It's pointing to some CRD for your mesh implementation. Is that correct understanding?
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah, so that means whatever you're pointing to, the CRD may have totally different definition, may not even have the section name or port. It's really
yes, for our CRD, we don't, section name is not meaningful in our CRD.
Thanks for clarifying the implementation specific bit of section name. I could see console potentially being able to benefit from that. That makes sense.
Cool. Well, yeah, I think there's been some great feedback on this already. I'm trying to make sure I didn't miss anything in chat. Also, yeah, I think this is everything. But please definitely add comments to this gap. Or Bowie, did you have any additional thoughts here?
Yeah, I just we should clarify why we need port versus section name. That's a question lingers in my mind. And then if we need port, do we need something else as well, or is port it?
Yeah, I think that port matching is a fairly common, well, a very common capability that you would want for mesh routing. Chow, I think you would know better than me on that, but I think that's important for your use case, right?
Yeah, and to one of Bowie's question, we can certainly use a section name to for port matching, but that will complicate the validation on section name. There was a proposal earlier to set to use the to set port number in section name under parent ref, and that's one of the options as well.
Yeah, maybe it would help if, can you expand on what the drawbacks were? Like you guys tried it, and I'm assuming that you found issues with it. So it'd be good to understand what those issues are. If other people kind of are thinking the same thing, then it helps to see where that ended up.
Yeah, it's probably not an issue. It's just how explicit the API should be. It's not that one approach is significantly better than the other. It's more opinionated.
Having both of, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Having both of these, both section name and port, makes sense to me from a perspective of Consul's implementation of this. Like, I'm seeing port as basically promoting something that could potentially be encoded into a string in an implementation specific way in section name, but promoting like a common config up to a more explicit, more like first class interface, and reserving section name for like the things that could be more implementation specific.
Yeah, that's actually a really good way to describe it. That I like that take on it. You know, we briefly discussed this concept last week. There was the issue that kind of inspired this gap was discussed last week, and I think at least I think both of these alternatives were discussed in that issue, and I think of the discussion that existed there, I think there was just some level of discomfort with the idea of overloading section name to basically be used for an end, to be used for, something like that is as common and well understood as a port, port number. That's basically the background I can think of on this, but I like Mike's description here as well. I think that's a good way to describe this proposal. Any last thoughts on this? Awesome. Well, hey, thanks for the good discussion on this, and thanks again to Chow for getting this gap together here. All right.
So I guess, Rob, I wasn't clear, like, what is the next step in terms of that one?
Yeah.
We have consensus, or like what's kind of?
Yeah, I don't think we have consensus yet. I would
Okay.
like some, I would like to get some discussion going on this gap itself. There are a few people out of today's meeting, but if it seems like there's at least some support for this gap, and so if you like this idea, just please comment on the PR. Would be good to hear other use cases for this.
I think like it would help if we add. We have some use cases, but it's like if we can add it to this to just kind of describe it, because as you're reading it, it kind of puts those things in your mind.
Yeah, it's okay if most of the use cases are mesh use cases, because for ingress, in this gap,
I think it's fine as long as one, it's well formed, like that it's an understandable thing, and I'm sure you can use it in the ingress case, and we should just add it in, and then we can kind of look at it as a whole.
Okay, yeah, because in this gap, we are mostly trying to make the fill reasonable for ingress without, at least for me, without any concrete use case in mind for ingress.
Yeah, I think it is at least potentially useful for ingress use cases, but like I do think this is a more generic way to attach and maybe even easier to understand way, but it is really an alternative to section name for ingress, and that could add some confusion, but yeah. Okay, well, yeah, I think what we need then from this is really just some additional conversation on the GEP itself. It sounds like there's a bit more detail that we can add to the GEP, but also just some review, comments, thoughts on this process. Would love to get this in, well, and to make a decision on this sooner than later. But you know, especially with holidays around the corner. But yeah, thanks a bunch, Chow, for starting this process off. And yeah, I think this is a good starting point. Cool. All right, well, that's I think a decent transition into the next item I wanted to discuss today, and that's at some point we need to define a cutoff for new features in 050. I know we want to get to 050 relatively soon. We want to release a beta early next year. And at some point, if we want to get to beta, if we want to cut that release, we need to stop adding new features and start working on cutting another release. As we saw last time with 040, it takes a while to get the final approval from our SIG network reviewers in upstream. And so we need to add some buffer time for that as well. So really what I'm trying to do with this item is just run through the gaps I'm aware of, try and understand current status, and maybe at the same time try and set some kind of goal or target date where we want GEPs to either be in or consider them cut off from this release. So first off, the main gaps of this release so far have been redirects and rewrites. That one is fully merged, fully in. That will be included in the next release unless we have any strong reservations, but that is in. Shane has led the address matching. The GEP is merged. I think, Shane, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're about to start on the implementation of that.
Yep.
Awesome. And
Tomorrow morning.
Cool, great, thanks. And then the other two, the final two here are much earlier in the stage here. One is port matching. We just discussed that today. GEP is proposed and we're moving. And finally is route inclusion, where there's a draft document, but this one feels like it may be not quite as far as along, at least for the complexity it might add. So I'm not as sure, you know, I think that it feels like to me, address matching is for sure going to get in. The GEP has merged. We're not that far off from an implementation. Port matching, we don't have consensus on, but there is a GEP and it is potentially smallish. And so maybe we can get this one in, and route inclusion is one that I am not as certain about. Jeff, I'm not sure. I don't see Jeff on this call. So I'm thinking that this one may end up missing the line, the cut line for 050. But I'm just trying to get a feeling from others here. Does this seem like an appropriate cut line if we, like when should we try to, have all GEPs in and ready for, implementations in and ready for SIG network review? That's a pretty broad question, but I think right now what I'm seeing is that we'll for sure get these top two in, and we might get port matching in, but I think we need to aim to have this all ready for review or API finalized early January. Does that line up with what others are thinking here? All right, well, I will, I'll add an issue or a discussion to follow up on this one, but at my current perspective, I think route inclusion may be at risk of dropping off this release. But we'll just see what happens. I really would like to keep on moving so we can make sure that we are ready for review sometime early in January, and we can get to beta sometime early next year. Yeah. Okay, well, it sounds like there's not too much of an opinion on that, but again, if you do have strong opinions on what we should or shouldn't include in our next release, or if you really want to push for something like getting in, definitely let me or anyone else know. Finally, I wanted to do just a quick survey. What Kubernetes clients are we using for implementations? I've been working on conformance tests and recently moved to the controller runtime client, and I was actually blown away by how much better it was than dynamic client, and almost better than generated client. But I was just curious, and that's just my own personal experience. But I'm interested in of other implementations out there. Have we? Is anyone using the client we're generating, or using dynamic client? Anything else?
We use controller runtime for the implementation. We use the generated client just for tests. But we made the move to controller runtime earlier this year as a whole for our ingress controller, and so everything gateway has been implemented on that.
Cool. Is there, out of curiosity, is there a reason you chose to use generated client for your tests?
Just simple and convenient, just
Yeah.
for integration tests and stuff.
Makes sense.
Maybe I'm misunderstanding your question.
No, that's it. So I've actually been the link I have is work in progress for conformance test here, but anyway, what I'm using, the link did not take me where I wanted to go, but where I'm using controller runtime client for conformance tests. So that's specifically why I was wondering, you mentioned using generated client specifically, so I was curious if I'd missed some potential benefits there. But
nope, from an integration testing standpoint, it's just easy to make one of those clients and then start doing your thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. And it seems like in chat a couple more for controller runtime. And yeah, okay. Sounds like everyone's moved to controller runtime. Awesome. All right. Well, that's easy enough. It makes me wonder. It does sound like there's at least one use case still for our generated client, but it does make me wonder if so many people are moving to controller runtime, if we'll need to, continue generating our client forever.
I could foresee it being useful for some of our end users in time. I'm at least aware of like one group that for our internal CRDs, right, uses our Go client, our generated client for our own CRDs. So I would hate to think that we would stop generating the client for gateway upstream. But at some point, it's just going to become part of the whole system anyway, right?
Yeah, that's fair.
So maybe it doesn't matter because it'll just transition and happen anyway at some point.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Okay, well, hey, that's cool. Good to see that so many people are already using controller runtime. And yeah, actually, I don't know, this may transition well into your item, Shane. You want to talk about watch predicates?
Yeah, so I guess this isn't like huge or anything. I just wanted to kind of run this by some people. So implementing route runtime has been, mostly good. And I had this conversation with Nick last week where he kind of encouraged me to bring this one up at the meeting today, but let me gather my thoughts just a bit. So the long and short of it is, having 3 different objects all with references, chained references to each other, is a little bit more complicated than, say, the normal like one-to-one object reference. You'll have like one object that references another. So now you have 3, and kind of the trio is required to know at any given point whether or not, in the case of routes, a data plane configuration should exist for one of them. So like HTTP route, you have to have that plus the gateway class, and there has to be kind of, just basically, is it supported? Is it in the class to know that it actually needs to have a data plane configuration? So I'll call it an edge case, but I did actually run into it while testing. So it was kind of easy to run into. But given the 3 different references, there was kind of this bug where if you rapidly deleted a gateway and a gateway class at the same time, but didn't touch the HTTP route, you ended up with this situation where the logic could lose track of whether or not it was ever supported. Because in controller runtime, we have like watches for the HTTP route controller, also watch gateway and gateway class, right? If one of them updates, it's fairly simple to say, okay, is this supported, so on, and then you go off and you roll a reconciliation for that object so that it can be updated appropriately, whether that's actually starting to include it or exclude it from the data plane configuration. So what I found was that I could run into situations where if I delete the gateway and gateway class rapidly, I could actually get an orphaned HTTP route data plane configuration. So I talked with Nick about this a bit because I actually was looking at reference implementations, and I found that like actually there's a couple of places where other people I think have the same problem. And I'm just wondering if people have dealt with this in any specific ways. I don't have a PR up for this quite yet within our own code base because I'm still kind of experimenting with it, but we kind of have this approach right now that at least works in testing of, which is really heavy-handed. If a gateway ever updates, reconcile basically all of the HTTP routes to make sure that you don't orphan one because of the chance that you won't be able to tell whether it was ever supported. And there's limitations like the HTTP route statuses, like the parent ref statuses can only do so much because you can still kind of get into this situation, I think, when a gateway changes in particular, where you wouldn't really know, things can get out of sync. So far it's just seemed better to just be like, all right, well, reconcile the world. But I don't really want to make a PR for that because it seems so heavy-handed. So hopefully I didn't talk too much and people can actually understand what I was getting at here. But I'm wondering if other people have had, and Nick kind of pushed me because he said, this was interesting to him too. He said, I wonder what other people are running into in this regard.
So when you say it's orphan, what does that mean? It means that your system configured the HTTP route as if all the other stuff existed, but then they like suddenly disappeared.
Yeah, so the whole walkthrough is like a gateway class, a gateway, and an HTTP route, which are supported by the controller, are all posted. Then the controller will pick that up and put that in the data plane. And then in our case, and so that's sitting in the data plane and traffic is routing to it through the actual gateway. If the gateway and gateway class both get updated rapidly so that they wouldn't be linked to each other anymore or deleted, in controller runtime, you don't have like, you don't get a watch of an object, but then also get a snapshot of like another object at the exact same time. You have to do a get, basically. You have to go reference that object by object reference. That object could be gone. That object could be changed. In the case of gateway class, when you're trying to reference it to HTTP routes in this kind of 3-way reference, it was the bug that was coming up was, oh, okay, it can't tell that this was a supported HTTP route and it doesn't reconcile it. Now, obviously, if the HTTP route itself ever updated again, it would get removed from the data plane. But so that's why I kind of call it an edge case. It's very technical in that you would have to never update the HTTP route, but technically it's wrong that the backend data plane configuration exists when the gateway has been dropped in such a way.
Yeah, as far as I know, speaking for our implementation, we do something like what you're saying, where we query to grab the object graph, like the whole object graph. We did kind of try to abstract it a little bit to make it so that when you're doing the query, you construct a query object rather than just explicitly going and just like listing everything, with the goal of potentially later optimizing that. But right now it just passes through directly and just grabs everything just to make sure we don't lose anything.
Okay, that's what Nick was kind of saying. He said I would find that's probably pretty common, is that everybody's just kind of grabbing the world to avoid losing any orphaning anything.
Yeah, that's as far as I can tell. That's what we're doing right now.
I appreciate that insight. And I guess if nobody else has any other like similar insights or something better, I mean, I'm going to continue to think about this and look for better solutions. We'll probably have something as a stopgap for a while, though.
Cool. That's a really interesting discussion. I got to think about that some more as far as what the ideal is, and if there's anything we can, recommend more generically, as a API implementation guidelines or anything like that.
Yeah, that's kind of the point of this, is like there's going to be an optimum algorithm for this, or the
Right.
heuristic. So I just like to not be in left field while there's a better way to do it, and wondered if anybody had already solved it. But if not, I think I'm going to continue to try to think on this. So, and then I guess the down the road there, maybe make a doc and we can all talk about it again after I've had some more time to kind of dig in. Because like I said, I just started kind of running into this, so haven't had a ton of time to dig into it yet.
This seems like just the perfect use case of GitHub Discussions, which you pioneered.
Yeah.
The API.
That'll probably be where I put it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm interested in. I know not every implementer is on this call right now, so I'm interested in what others think as well. Cool. All right. Well, I think that's all for this one, unless anyone else want to chime in. Cool. All right. Next one I wanted to go to is Chrismar. You have a PR for validating HP route filters. I think is awfully close. What's the current state on it?
Yeah, I pushed up a commit yesterday and made some changes that change that you suggested. So all that remains is that I remove the deep equal, because I'm doing a deep equal. But the problem is that the deep equal, the equality, the comparison, the comparison, equal, that one, depending on, it works depending on the fields of the struct. And the problem is that some fields are arrays or pointers, or maybe like a type, a concrete type. I'm not sure, but the problem is that it didn't work when I was running the test. That's why I realized that some had to use deep equal. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but that's why I'm using deep equal in some places, and in some places I'm using the only the comparison.
That's
Does that make
interesting.
sense?
Yeah, I'd also assume that you wouldn't need deep equal here. Yeah, I'm interested in the tests that failed or anything like that. I can try and help out, figure out what's going on there. Yeah, weird, but yeah. Otherwise, I think this I agree with James here. This algae, this looks great. Other than that one last thing, at least based on the last time I looked at it. Yeah, thanks for taking this one on. I know this has been a big one.
Yeah, it's been big, but I've learned a lot. So
cool, awesome. All right, the last one, and this one, I don't think anyone who's been involved in the conversation is on this call, so I may leave this one out. But I wanted to come back to this PR at some point. There was a PR that suggested that we should consider termination a valid combination with TLS route. this had I think a discussion that was mostly between James and Jeff on this one, or Harry as well. But yeah, it looks like none of the people that were that involved in this discussion are on this call. So I'll hold off till the next meeting to dig into this one. Yeah, just hold off. But this is a PR that's kind of sat untouched for a while, and I'd just like to reach some consensus on it one way or the other. And that's all. I think that's the only recent issues, PRs, etc. I think we've covered everything. Anyone have any open topics they want to raise in the last few minutes here? All right, well, if not, have a good rest of your week, and we'll talk to at least some of you next week. Have a great one.
Cheers.